Have I stayed away too long? Have I stayed away too long? If I came home tonight, would you still be my darling, or have I stayed away too long?
We're talking today with Larry Jordan. Larry is the author of the 672-page book, Jim Reeves, His Untold Story, which has won numerous accolades, including a prestigious Hollywood Book Award. And it's even been described by one award committee chairman as being on par with Pulitzer Prize-winning books. Now, it took 13 years to write this book, and it's based on more than 500 interviews, plus the personal diaries of Jim and his wife, Mary. Now, Larry Jordan became acquainted with the singer's widow when he was just 13 years of age, and that friendship lasted until Mary passed away in 1999. A total of 33 years. Now, in addition, in 2002, Larry Jordan founded an indie label called Voice Masters. He did it to release a series of CDs that Larry has produced on various artists, including unissued tracks by Jim Reeves, that he, as producer, has overdubbed with new music featuring world-class musicians. So, before we get underway, we should tell you that there is a beautiful new 8-CD set out called The Great Jim Reeves, and it includes over 170 tracks and 92 overdubs that have been called stunning and breathtaking, and a whole lot of other superlatives by fans and reviewers alike. And this is even written up in Billboard magazine. So let's begin. Larry, welcome. You've studied Jim Reeves for many years. What was he really like?
Briefly stated, Jim Reeves was a much more complex personality than most of his fans surmised. As a matter of fact, Mary Reeves told me the first time we met way back in 1966 when I was just a boy visiting her in Nashville, that Jim was 3 or 4 different people. He lived his life in airtight compartments. She told me Jim didn't want anybody to know everything about him. In fact, she said there were areas of his life he didn't even want her to know about. Reeves was a great one for playing things close to the vest, even with his own wife. After years of research, I have reconstructed Jim's life on virtually a day-to-day basis, from his diaries and interviews I've done, news clippings, his private correspondence. And I think the picture that emerges is of a man who had many virtuous qualities and, like a lot of us, some big imperfections. But above all, he strove for excellence in everything he did. And I think you can hear that in his music.
Yeah, indeed, you can. What was the thing that surprised you the most about Jim Reeves?
I was struck by how many people I interviewed who, even after all these years, were moved to tears in thinking and talking about Jim. That's how much he touched their lives. Some even named their sons after him. And I think any man who could have that lasting of an impact on people was pretty extraordinary indeed.
You know, Jim Reeves started out singing high-pitched, kind of a honky-tonk style, and then there was this major style change in his music, and he became a crooner, this elegant balladeer, seemingly overnight. All of a sudden, he had a richer voice on his records and these dulcet tones. How did that change come about?
As I reveal in my book, in 1954, Faber Robison, Jim's first producer, introduced him to a Hollywood publicist named B. Terry, who is about 5 years older than Reeves. They hit it off right away and became best friends and later lovers. B was the unseen hand helping guide Jim's career. She's the one that helped him get booked on his first foreign tour at Christmas in 1954 with Forrest Tucker and Catherine Grant, who later became Mrs. Bing Crosby. B sung Jim's praises to Steve Scholes at RCA. She helped him get on the Grand Ole Opry. And most importantly, after Jim signed with RCA and saw his career falter, he put out 4 songs that didn't do much on the charts. B sat him down and told him his singing was all wrong, that he was vocalizing too loudly, and it was making him come off harsh. She asked him why he didn't sing in the studio the way he sang to her, softly and intimately. There had been an engineer at RCA who had insisted that Jim stand several feet away from the microphone and sing loudly, and Bea told Jim not to do that anymore. She said, tell him to turn up the volume. She also told him to get rid of the silly novelty songs and sing romantic ballads so that he would have a wider appeal. And she knew he was perfectly capable of doing this. Well, around the same time, in early 1956, Jim had written Bea a song, scribbling it out on a tablet while he was on an RCA-sponsored March of Dimes train tour with other artists like Vaughn Monroe, Eddie Fisher, Billy Eckstine, all of them great crooners. And he gave the song to Bea in partial payment for all the things that she had done to help him. As a favor to her, he recorded the song her way, singing closer to the mic and in a much more tender manner, which brought out his rich baritone, and thus his velvet style was born. That song was Am I Losing You? And if you listen to the material that Jim recorded leading up to this number, you see that he made a big transformation with this song. He sang in a completely different style. This was his road to Damascus experience, and it encouraged him to do the next song the same mellow way, that being the big hit, Four Walls.
Wow, that is amazing. Now, aside from the song that Jim wrote and recorded for Bea Terry, there was another song he did for her, wasn't there?
Jim wrote that song after his lady friend out in California, Bea Terry, had been sexually assaulted by a serial rapist who broke into her Hollywood apartment. He didn't rape her, but he tied her up and terrified her. Jim was in Florida at the time, and Bea called Jim's manager, Herb Schuker, on the road and told him what happened, but asked him to please break it to Jim gently because she was afraid of how he'd react if he read about the assault in the papers, because Bea was a well-known Hollywood publicist. He'd literally want to track down and kill the assailant. When Jim and Bea finally spoke on the phone, it was a very emotional call, and Bea said that Jim was crying and very much unconsolable. She finally convinced him to stay on tour and not rush to her side. But as Jim was sometimes prone to do, he put his emotions into a song called Need Me.
Larry, you're very candid in your book about Jim's interaction with members of the opposite sex, to say the least.
A few readers of my book, Jim Reeves' Untold Story, have been very upset that I have talked about some of Jim's behavior with women other than his wife. Obviously, this conflicted with his religious views, but some of these females, like Bea Terry or Wilma Sedevy, his Iowa fan club rep, or Judy Ford, the young rodeo star with whom he was spending time in the final months of his life, these women had a real impact on Jim. He wrote songs for and about them. He confided in them. They guided him.
Well, in the music industry, Jim Reeves was known as quite the perfectionist, wasn't he?
Jim was very serious about his music. He wanted everything just right. All the accompaniment, the volume of the various instruments, and so forth. But he was just as critical of his own vocal inflections. And no matter how close to perfection he came, he always thought he could have sung it better. He was never satisfied.
Right. Well, there are some stories floating around that Jim had sort of a short fuse. Is that true, Larry?
He told Shirley Doherty, an aspiring young singer, and the daughter of a couple of dear friends of his, to be sure to treat people well on your way up the ladder of success, because you were likely to also encounter them on the way down.
Well, and he did acquire the nickname Gentleman Jim.
So many people that I've interviewed over the years have said that that appellation really did fit Jim to a T. He was a gentleman. One thing he did not like, however, was a drunken woman.
I've often heard Jim Reeves was very close to his mom, and even though he'd been a pro athlete and was sort of a man's man, he bragged that he was very proud to be his mother's son, didn't he?
Jim Reeves was very devoted to his mother. He really loved her, and I think that speaks well of his character. He scoured antique shops and bought her an accordion like he knew she liked to play. He got her new linoleum for her kitchen floor. He bought her a sapphire ring, a set of ivory dominoes, and helped re-roof her house with his brother-in-law. He even bought a car so his sister Ivy could drive their mother around. But Beulah was a hard-bitten countrywoman, by the way, who dipped snuff and even smoked a pipe at times. After all, she raised a brood of kids on her own. They were sharecroppers. She knew a hard life, but Jim tried to make it a little easier for her. She lived to a ripe old age and routinely welcomed fans to her home and later to the nursing home where she lived in the later years of her life.
Well, I know that Jim's fans are very devoted to him, and he's still hugely popular in Europe and South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, Asia, even places like Sri Lanka. Larry, you write in your book that Jim Reeves had a photographic memory, and he would remember the names of people he met and even do kind gestures for them that were never really publicized or talked about, huh?
Jim Reeves's fans are among the most devoted fans in the world. They have remained loyal to him. They cherish any recordings they have of his. I've been amazed over the years how interested they are even in the minutiae of his life. That's why I included so many details in my book. And Jim reciprocated this love for his fans. He truly did. He insisted that everybody who took the time to write him got a reply. He would stay as long as it took after a show to sign autographs, often to the dismay of his band members, incidentally, who knew they had to risk breaking their necks to hurry to the next venue just because Jim ran so late. But Jim Reeves was accessible to his fans, unlike the stars today who have layers of insulation and security guards and all the hoopla surrounding them.
I know a lot of fans have commented that they just don't feel that Jim Reeves has gotten the credit that he deserves for the influence he had on the music industry, even today's artists some. I mean, you seldom hear his records played, at least on American radio, and he gets overlooked in articles. Yet he's influenced a lot of performers ranging from Elton John to Daniel O'Donnell and Vince Gill, right?
I think there are still people in Nashville who resent Jim's success and don't regard him as a country singer, even though he had a string of country songs. I think a lot of this is jealousy because Jim was able to sing in a style that appealed to pop fans as well. And some of these other artists could not. They just didn't have the chops. Just listen to some of the records that were being made in Nashville at the time when Reeves was doing his country pop recordings. They were very much cornpone and downright goofy. But Jim wanted to bring sophistication to country music, and some of his colleagues in the music industry just couldn't measure up.
Larry, what's the thing that surprised you the most when you were doing your research into the life of Jim Reeves?
I was struck by how many people I interviewed who, even after all these years, were moved to tears in thinking and talking about Jim. That's how much he touched their lives. Some even named their sons after him. And I think any man who could have that lasting of an impact on people was pretty extraordinary indeed.
Mr. Reeves was one very busy entertainer, wasn't he? I mean, he was on the road a lot.
Jim was a very restless man. When he was home, not working, he was not at home. He was off doing something, carousing in Nashville with Dean Manuel or Hank Cochran, or flying with Buddy Killen to Texas to see women. He just couldn't remain still. There was one 5-month period when Jim was only home one weekend.
Holy cow. Surely that hectic schedule took a toll on his health, too, didn't it?
Jim appeared to be of robust health, but the final years of his life he suffered from ulcers, which forced him to curtail his touring in the summer of 1963. He told B. Terry that he would give $1 million if he could find some relief from the ulcers. He was suffering so much. If that had been reported to the FAA, as it should have been, he would have been grounded from flying. Jim also had an athlete's heart and high blood pressure, and he chronicled in one of his diaries on the first South African tour in '62 that he was even experiencing frequent nosebleeds, which relieved his headaches when they occurred. But this cannot be good. This is a serious health issue. Like a lot of other entertainers then and now, Jim pushed himself beyond what he should have. And I think near the end of his life, he realized that he needed not to work as hard. He told his friends he was going to hang up his guitar and only play the big dates. And he was looking for a ranch to buy in Texas. Mary told him the only way she would go back to Texas was in a pine box.
Wow. Larry, can you tell us what Jim was doing in the final days of his life?
Fans probably know that Jim had a passion for golf. In fact, Mary told me that one day when the weather was bad in Nashville, Jim called the airport to find out where in the country it wasn't raining so he could fly there to play golf. Despite having a terrible head cold for which he'd gone to his doctor and gotten a prescription for cough syrup just the Friday before he died, Jim even dragged himself out on the links 2 days in a row the last weekend when pro golfer Billy Maxwell, who was a friend of his, was in Nashville. That last week or 10 days, in addition to playing golf with Del Reeves and Dean Manuel, Jim also played with Bob Luman. On occasion, he'd play golf with Eddie Arnold and Chet Atkins, also Boots Randolph, but not as often as some have claimed.
You described Jim Reeves as plotting the course of his career and having long-range goals. Now, had he lived, what do you think he would have been doing in the years ahead?
Despite Jim's talk of retirement, he told friends that he was going to give the music business another year, maybe two. Plans were already afoot to have him star in another movie in South Africa. In fact, some of the music was being written for this unnamed film. He wanted to go to acting school, as Mary said, and become a great actor. In fact, he talked about leaving Nashville years earlier and moving to Hollywood, but B. Terry had dissuaded him from that. It is true that Jim had been offered a television show by NBC to compete with Jimmy Dean's on ABC, and in fact, that's why Jim hired Bill Walker, a talented arranger whom he'd met in South Africa, and put him on salary even before Walker arrived in the States. Bill was going to be the musical director of Jim's new TV show, though the details had not been ironed out. Reeves was resisting moving to New York, and that's why the television deal didn't get consummated. I also think Jim probably would have gravitated toward Branson at some point when it became a music mecca. He certainly spent time in the Missouri Ozarks, and he'd also talked with B. Terry many times over the years about opening a dinner theater and having her manage it. That was a dream of his. But fate had other plans for Jim.
Well, I know Jim was going to be having another recording session right after he got back from a Texas tour. Do you have any idea of what he had planned to record?
That last week in July 1964, Jim had met with his producer, Chet Atkins, at RCA to go over some of the songs he was planning to record right after his next tour. One of these was a tune called The Voice, written by Bud Augie and Red Johnson. Red told me how he had been helping his friend Mr. Augie one day build a garage, and they took a coffee break, and while they were sitting at the kitchen table for a few minutes, this song was born. They shared it with a DJ friend of theirs, who in turn brought it to Mary Reeves. She liked it, and so did Jim, and so he planned to record it on the next session. Sadly, he never got to do that. Rex Allen did eventually record it, but changed the last line of the song out of deference to his wife, instead of singing it the way it had been originally written, in which the man of the song succumbs to temptation. But Arnie Benoni, who is a very popular recording artist in Norway, who sings in a style very similar to Reeves, recently made a demo of the song in which he sang it exactly as written. I think you'll easily be able to tell that this is a quintessential Jim Reeves-style song.
As her voice talks to me, teardrops glisten, 'cause I'll make someone suffer, I know. But she'll be far from my mind when I'm kissing the voice that I loved long ago. She'll be far from my mind when I'm kissing the voice that I loved long ago.
Oh, that is beautiful. On a more sobering note, I understand that Mary Reeves told you that Jim had a premonition that he may not live very long, right?
Jim was very fatalistic about not living to an old age. Some of this may have stemmed from the fact that his father was a relatively young man when he died, and Jim also lost some brothers before their time. But in the final months of his life, Reeves actually foresaw his own demise. I tell in the book about how when he and B. Terry were on their way to the airport out in L.A., along with a friend of theirs, Ned Miller, Jim commented idly that he had a premonition that one of these days, one of those big birds was going to bury its nose in the ground, and he was going to be in it. He actually foresaw his own death. B. Terry and Jim shared an interest in the psychic. I don't mean that they consulted clairvoyance or anything like that, but they were fascinated by the subject of ESP and would often experiment with trying to reach each other just through thoughts. Similarly, he would tell her that when she needed him to think me, in other words, for her to concentrate on him, and 9 times out of 10, when she'd do that, he would call without fail, regardless of what hour of the day or night it was. So there was something going on between the two of them, and they liked exploring that subject of parapsychology or what have you.
Well, Larry, in your book, you have a couple of fascinating chapters leading up to and following Jim's tragic plane crash. And I'm sure our listeners will all be intrigued to know that you discuss some unsolved mysteries surrounding that crash, including the fact that a lot of the paperwork relating to the Reeves accident is still locked up with Kennedy assassination records, and that a federal judge even ordered the destruction of certain records after you filed a Freedom of Information Act request to see them. I find that intriguing and very interesting. I understand Jim and his band were in Dallas the night before and the day of JFK's murder, and that they had just played a nightclub there that had been co-owned by Jack Ruby. And you write that when Jim saw Lee Harvey Oswald's photo on TV, he recognized him right away as having come to the dances that they put on at that very club. And you even suspect that authorities deliberately misdirected searchers away from the very spot that the airport radar controllers told them they could find the wreckage, and hence it supposedly took 2 days to locate. Now, I know you're still of the opinion that weather was a factor in Jim's crash, fine, but you also point out the strange things that happened after the plane went down and how the FBI even got involved and questioned a possible link to organized crime. So there's a lot to this story.
It was so tragic what happened to Jim and Dean, and it didn't have to happen. As I explain in my book, Jim actually got his pilot's license before he was ready. He had been on the road that spring of 1963. He'd been overseas making the movie in South Africa, and then he went to Ireland for a grueling tour. And he didn't have any chance during this period to practice his flying, and yet he comes home and immediately gets his pilot's license on June 30th. It is indisputable that Jim was not competent to fly at that point. Even months later, he was making big mistakes, such as one time when he stalled the aircraft. And furthermore, Jim had no business being in a more advanced aircraft like the Beechcraft Debonair as compared with the slower Cessna he normally flew. And he didn't even have the requisite number of hours, 200, to even fly it. But Fred Bunyan, a salesman for Southeastern Beechcraft, is the one who approached Jim about buying the Beech. And although Jim told his wife Mary that he had no intention of buying a plane, at the very least he flew it when he lacked all the requisite skills. So this was an accident waiting to happen.
Larry, your research has also served as the basis for an entire chapter in a book called Hit List by Richard Belzer and David Wayne. Without going into all of those details, can you tell us briefly what caused the plane to go down?
I go into the minute-by-minute series of events that led up to the fatal crash based on information I was able to glean from the long-lost accident report and also numerous interviews that I did with people at the airport and so forth. And I talk about the 3 mistakes that Jim made that sealed his fate. Basically, he miscalculated the ability of a small but intense storm cell to intersect his flight path. The controller had offered to vector him around it and told him that a right turn would keep him clear of the rain, but Jim said he saw the rain area and thought that his present heading would take him to the right of it, so he did not change course. If the weather had remained as he saw it, he would have been all right. But as he flew northeasterly toward Franklin Road, he flew underneath the rain cell, and it opened up on him, and he lost his forward visibility. He radioed the control tower, and they advised him that he should be out of the rain in about a minute. 30 seconds later, the controller radioed back to ask Jim if he was clear of the rain area, and Jim started to say negative, but only got out part of the word. He said nega, and that was all that was heard on the tower tape. What had happened in the meantime is that instead of turning right to avoid the rain, Jim had relied on his instincts more than his training, and he turned left, apparently to try to reestablish visual reference to Franklin Road that he'd just flown over. But this had the net effect of taking him further into the intense rain. He apparently got a lightning flash, yanked the yoke too hard. He was afraid of lightning anyway because his brother had been killed by it. The left wing went up, the right wing went down, and appropriate course of action would be to level the wings, but he did not do this. He applied full power without leveling the wings, and it steepened the turn, and he had no time to recover before he hit the ground. It was all over in a matter of seconds.
Wow, it was such a tragedy. Explain, if you can, what happened right after Jim died.
Less than 24 hours after the plane wreckage was found, an item appeared in Red O'Donnell's column in the Nashville Banner newspaper stating that Mary Reeves had risen to the presidency of Jim Reeves Enterprises, which of course struck some people around town as unseemly, coming as it did before Jim was even buried. The day before his funeral, Joyce Jackson, who served on and off as his secretary, and Tom Perryman, a business partner of his from Texas, got on extension phones at the funeral home, believe it or not, vying for airtime as they both gave interviews to radio stations. Now, this is before the funeral has even taken place, and they're at the funeral home. Maybe they were just in a state of shock, but you'd almost never know from their demeanor that a terrible tragedy had occurred involving the loss of life, Jim Reeves and Dean Manuel. Instead, Ms. Jackson and Mr. Perryman obviously went out of their way to assure the public that it was going to be business as usual as they promoted Jim's records.
I think it's amazing. Jim Reeves had 34 charted hits after his death, the only artist in the history of recorded music to ever achieve that. And he stayed on the charts for over 20 years. Mary Reeves has gotten a lot of credit for that. What's the real story behind everything there?
Mary was often asked how she got the idea to release Jim's music as if he were still alive, and she never could quite answer that. For some reason, she just didn't seem to want to give Jim credit for this. But the truth is, he was the one who came up with the idea. So she was only following the game plan that he himself had laid out for her, visionary that he was, in the event something would happen to him. There was a lot of posthumous success with Jim's records, but Mary went on instinct in releasing his product. She was musically ignorant for the most part. In essence, Jim's music sold itself.
Right. But after Jim's death, Mary Reeves became very visible, didn't she?
Mary Reeves became, over the years, a shrewd businesswoman. She didn't start out that way. She dropped out of college, worked in a dime store, later was a bookkeeper for a car dealer as Jim was getting his first job in radio. And finally, when he decided to go on the road full-time and pursue a career in music, she went with him. She helped to drive. She handled the money. But ironically, she would usually stay at the motel rather than go to the show because she said she didn't like to see the women fawn all over him. At least that's what she told Jenny Wright. When Jim was alive, he was the star, and Mary stayed in the background. She didn't do interviews. She was strictly a behind-the-scenes person. But when Jim was killed, Mary stepped into the spotlight and became sort of the surrogate artist. She had her own publicity photos taken and periodically updated. She gave interviews on behalf of Jim. And the interesting contrast between the two of them is that, Jim had been very candid. He would usually tell you what was on his mind. Mary, on the other hand, developed some canned answers to frequently asked questions. So you never really got under the surface with her, except privately. That was a different story. I knew her well enough. We could talk about anything, and she'd share confidences with me and her frustrations with RCA or whatever. But when it came to dealing with the public, Mary maintained a sunny but very superficial image.
Larry, would you say that Jim was a happy man or not?
I don't think there can be any doubt that Jim Reeves was deeply conflicted, and although he was normally a bright, upbeat, seemingly happy-go-lucky person around a lot of his friends and fans, he also had an inner sadness. B. Terry said that in the end she felt that he had nothing left to do but die. Maybe that's too pessimistic of a view, but Mr. Reeves was, in many ways, a very moral man whose word was his bond, and I think a lot of his behavior did trouble him. He could be a man of contrasts. He could be stingy, but also very generous. He was like a lot of stars and sometimes quite arrogant, and yet he could be tremendously empathetic and truly care about other people and try to help them. Chet Atkins told me one day on the golf course that, quote, Jim Reeves was unhappy because he wanted to be perfect, and he knew he wasn't, unquote. But when it came to his music, we can all be glad that Jim was such a perfectionist.
Well, indeed we can. Indeed we can. His music is timeless and will live on for many years to come, especially thanks to the wonderful CD releases that you've done for Voice Masters and in this exhaustive biography of Jim. Well, our thanks to Larry Jordan, author of this 672-page book, Jim Reeves, His Untold Story. It's a very detailed and well-documented account of this wonderful singer's fascinating life. Now, if you haven't yet ordered a copy, you can do so online. Just go to www.jimreevesbook.com. That's jimreevesbook.com. Thanks for listening. I'm Mike Austin, and we thank you for joining us.
Some glad morning when this life is o'er, I'll fly away to a home on God's celestial shore. I'll fly away. I'll fly away, oh glory, I'll fly away. When I die, hallelujah, by and by, I'll fly away. When the shadows of this life have flown, I'll fly away. Like a bird from prison bars has flown,